For 22 years, Janice Dean's alarm went off before almost anyone else in America was awake. While most of the country was still asleep, she was already in hair and makeup, already reviewing her weatherboards, already getting ready to walk out onto a plaza in whatever the sky decided to throw at her that day. Viewers knew her as the meteorologist who made freezing mornings feel warmer, the woman who could crack a joke in the middle of a snowstorm and somehow still make it feel like a good day. What most of those viewers never knew was that she was doing all of it while quietly living with a disease that has no cure. Now, at 56 years old, Janice Dean has said goodbye to Fox and Friends, and the story behind that goodbye is far more complicated and far more human than a simple career change. On June 25, 2026, Janice Dean posted a video to her social media accounts that caught even her most devoted fans off guard. There was no slow rollout, no network press release preparing the audience for what was coming. It was just Janice speaking directly into the camera, telling the people who had watched her for over 2 decades that she was stepping away from Fox and Friends for good. She didn't dress it up. Dean explained that her multiple sclerosis symptoms had progressed to a point where she could no longer keep pace with the demands of her role, and that her doctors had agreed that walking away was the responsible thing to do for her health. For a woman who had built an entire public identity around cheerfulness and resilience, that kind of blunt honesty landed differently. It wasn't a farewell built on nostalgia. It was a woman telling the truth about her body in front of millions of strangers. In the video, she described what it's actually like to live with MS while performing on live television, describing the disease as an ongoing internal war. She explained that her immune system had been attacking her brain, spinal cord, and at times her optic nerve, leaving damage that only shows up on an MRI scan. It's not the kind of detail morning show hosts typically share with their audience, and that's precisely why it hit so many viewers so hard. She also said she was thankful to have caught the disease early, and that she had spent more than 2 decades cycling through different treatments trying to keep her symptoms under control. But she was clear-eyed about the limits of modern medicine, too. There is still no cure for MS, and over time, no matter how disciplined she was about managing her health, her symptoms simply progressed. For millions of people who only ever saw Janice Dean laughing with her co-hosts on the couch, or standing outside in freezing temperatures making the weather segment feel like a party, this admission was jarring. What had looked for 22 years like effortless charm was, underneath it all, a woman fighting a private battle every single morning before the cameras even turned on. Here's something a lot of viewers never fully grasped. Janice Dean was waking up at 2:30 in the morning, 5 days a week, for more than 2 decades. Not occasionally, not during a rough stretch. Every single workday, for 22 years straight. For a long stretch of that run, she could handle it. The early hours, the long stretches on her feet, the constant pressure of live national broadcasting. But she has also been honest about something most people in her position rarely admit out loud. Waking up that early and performing on camera is difficult for anyone. But it is a different kind of difficult when your immune system is quietly attacking your own nervous system. When Fox News Media released its statement on her departure, the language was warm and respectful, praising her resilience, her dedication, and her willingness to be open about her personal journey. The network said it fully supported her decision and was grateful for everything she had contributed over the years. On its face, that reads like a clean, amicable exit. But look closer, and it becomes clear this wasn't a retirement Janice Dean was necessarily ready for on her own terms. It was one her body eventually forced. Think about what a 2:30 a.m. wake-up call actually requires over the course of 2 decades. It means going to bed long before most people finish dinner. It means skipping dinners out, missing evening plates with friends, and building an entire life around a body clock that almost no one would choose voluntarily. For someone without a chronic illness, that kind of schedule alone would be grueling over 22 years. For someone managing an autoimmune disease that attacks the nervous system, doctors widely agree that sleep deprivation and chronic stress are 2 of the most damaging triggers there are. Both are known to intensify MS symptoms and increase the likelihood of flare-ups. In effect, Dean spent more than 2 decades doing the opposite of what her body needed, because she loved her job and wasn't ready to let it go. And unlike a job where you can push through a bad day on willpower alone, MS doesn't offer that kind of consistency. Some mornings bring overwhelming fatigue. Others bring muscle weakness, numbness, balance trouble, or sudden changes in vision, often without much warning. Live television doesn't leave much room for a bad day. Once the cameras are rolling, the audience expects the same energy and the same smile, morning after morning after morning. That alone would be exhausting for anyone. Doing it while managing a chronic neurological disease, day after day, for over 2 decades, required a level of determination that most viewers never fully appreciated. This wasn't simply an employee deciding to move on. This was a woman quietly weighing her health against her career for years, likely long before anyone watching at home noticed that anything was wrong. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back to the fall of 2005. Janice Dean was 35 years old. She had just landed her job at Fox. She was in a relationship she was excited about, and life, by her own description, felt like it was finally coming together. When she started feeling unusually tired, she brushed it off as overwork and not taking care of herself. Then, in October of that year, everything changed. She traveled to Ottawa to introduce her boyfriend, Sean, a New York City firefighter, to her family. During that trip, the fatigue she had been dismissing suddenly became impossible to ignore. She woke up one morning and could not get out of bed. She has described the sensation as something like a heavy blanket pressing down on her entire body. She couldn't feel the bottoms of her feet. There was a strange, spreading numbness in her thighs that made no sense to her. Doctors ran a battery of tests, including an MRI and a spinal tap. The results confirmed multiple sclerosis, an autoimmune condition believed to affect roughly 1 million people in the United States, most commonly diagnosed in adults between the ages of 20 and 50, and significantly more often in women than in men. Dean has since described that moment as one of the most frightening of her life. She remembers believing in that instant that everything was about to fall apart, that her boyfriend would leave, that she would end up in a wheelchair, that she would lose the job at Fox she had barely started. All of her plans for the future, she has said, felt like they were collapsing at once. None of that happened the way she feared. Sean didn't leave. The two got married in 2007 and went on to build a family together, welcoming 2 sons, Matthew and Theodore. She didn't lose her job either. Instead, she kept showing up, kept setting that 2:30 a.m. alarm, and slowly became one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television for the next 2 decades. What's striking is how private she initially kept her diagnosis. She didn't turn it into a headline right away. Instead, she spent years quietly managing the disease while building her on-air career, carrying the fear that everything could change again at any moment. It was only once she felt more secure, both in her career and in her marriage, that she began speaking publicly about what she had gone through. That openness eventually led to a memoir, giving her a way to turn what had once felt like the worst moment of her life into something that connected her with millions of people quietly fighting the same disease. In interviews over the years, Dean has said that talking publicly about MS became unexpectedly healing for her. What had once felt like a private burden slowly turned into something she could use to encourage others facing the same diagnosis. Rather than letting fear write her story, she chose to show people that life could go on and even thrive after devastating news. That honesty earned her respect not just from her regular viewers, but from people inside the MS community who saw pieces of their own story reflected in hers. Long before her farewell video in June 2026, there were smaller signals that something was shifting. Back in November of the previous year, Dean posted on social media that she was stepping away from work and from social media temporarily. At the time, she didn't specify exactly what health issues she was dealing with. She simply said she needed rest and time to heal, and that her bosses at Fox had been understanding about giving her the space to focus on her family. She mentioned taking a trip to Rome with her husband during that break, describing it as a good place to begin healing spiritually. Fans assumed, or maybe just hoped, That this was a short pause, the kind of recharge she would come back from stronger, the way she always had before. That's not how it played out. Instead, that temporary break became the beginning of a longer reckoning. Looking back, the timeline says a lot on its own. A woman who had powered through more than 2 decades of brutal early mornings without any extended time off suddenly needed a real break just to rest and heal. That alone should have been a signal that something deeper was happening. At the time, she didn't publicly connect that break to her multiple sclerosis. She simply said she needed rest. It would take several more months before she tied the two together and confirmed that her MS symptoms were the actual reason behind both the break and, eventually, her full departure from the show. Once her departure became official, there was still one moment fans were waiting for, a real goodbye, delivered in person, on the same couch where she had spent thousands of mornings over the years. On July 10, 2026, Janice Dean returned to the Fox and Friends set one last time, not to work a shift, but to properly say goodbye to the audience and the crew she had spent more than 2 decades with. She didn't hold it together. Sitting on the familiar couch, she became emotional while thanking viewers for welcoming her into their homes every morning for over 20 years. She talked about meeting fans outside the studio, doing weather segments alongside kids in the crowd, and called the entire experience an honor. She also opened up about something she admitted she had never fully addressed on air before, even after years of sharing so much of her personal life with viewers. She said that while she had shared a lot over the years, maybe even too much at times, she realized she had never actually said a proper goodbye. She wanted this moment to be different. Dean described her time away from the show as a kind of grieving period. She explained that when someone steps away from a job or a career they've poured decades into, there's a real sense of loss that people don't always talk about honestly. She referred to the Fox and Friends crew as her second family and said this final on-air goodbye would help her process that loss. She also credited her husband, Sean Newman, a retired battalion chief with the New York City Fire Department, for taking on the bulk of those brutal early mornings at home so she could keep pursuing her career. The show played a montage of highlights from her run, including live storm coverage from the middle of major weather events in New York City, alongside lighter, more personal moments from inside the studio. The crew gave her farewell gifts as the segment came to a close. Her final comment on the moment was about turning the page. She said that closing this chapter had felt heavy, but that she hoped things would feel lighter from here. For longtime viewers, watching a woman known for decades of unshakable positivity finally let her guard down on camera was more powerful than any official network statement could have been. What looked, from the outside, like a graceful exit was really a body finally asking for mercy after 22 years of being pushed past its limits. Dean has made it clear that this next chapter is about her health and her family first. She has specifically talked about wanting to spend more time with her 2 teenage sons, something those 2:30 a.m. wake-up calls made difficult for years. She isn't disappearing from public life. Dean has spent years as a vocal advocate for the multiple sclerosis community, connecting with others living with the disease and sharing her own experience to help people feel less alone in their diagnosis. She is also the author of a 2019 memoir, in which she wrote candidly about living with MS long before this most recent chapter closed. According to the Mayo Clinic, multiple sclerosis is a chronic disease in which the immune system mistakenly attacks myelin, the protective coating around nerve fibers throughout the body. That damage disrupts communication between the brain and the rest of the body, and over time it can cause permanent nerve damage. There is still no cure, only treatments designed to slow its progression and manage symptoms. That single medical reality reframes Dean's entire 22-year run at Fox and Friends. Every early broadcast, every outdoor weather segment in freezing conditions, every hour spent under studio lights happened while her body was fighting a battle with no finish line and no cure in sight. It also explains why her advocacy has meant so much to the MS community over the years. Unlike a celebrity who mentions a diagnosis once and moves on, Dean spent 2 decades showing up publicly week after week, while quietly managing a disease that affects roughly 1 million Americans. For many people newly diagnosed with MS, Watching someone stay visible and successful on national television for that long offered proof that a diagnosis doesn't have to mean the end of a dream. What comes through clearly in everything she has said publicly is that this wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't one she made lightly after 22 years of building a career and a following. But by her own account, and by her doctors, it was a necessary one. There's something worth noting about how Dean has framed her own story from the very beginning. She has never described her diagnosis as something that defined or limited her. Even in her darkest moment back in 2005, when she feared losing everything, she found a way to keep working for another 20 years. Her exit from Fox and Friends isn't the story of someone giving up. It's the story of someone finally choosing to protect herself after decades of putting the job first. It's also worth remembering just how much she gave to that early morning slot before finally stepping away. Fox and Friends built a real part of its identity around her weather coverage, her live storm reporting, and her easy chemistry with the rest of the desk. Replacing someone who spent 22 years becoming a fixture in millions of households isn't something any network does easily. Whoever eventually fills that meteorologist chair will be stepping into a role that Janice Dean spent 2 decades defining. For Dean herself, though, this was never really about the show's future. It was about her own. After 20 years of managing a disease that has no cure and only grows more demanding to control, choosing family time and physical healing over a national television slot isn't a controversial decision. By every account she has given publicly, it's simply the choice that had become unavoidable. Janice Dean spent more than 2 decades convincing the country that no matter how early the alarm went off, she would show up smiling. She managed a disease with no cure for as long as her body would allow. Now at 56, she's finally choosing herself on her own terms.